Who's there? I see somebody. It's Steven. That's what I figured. I don't know if Eric... You're good. I just now went. You're screwing a cabinet. Does Eric know? Hasn't seen anything yet, I don't think. Let's tag him real quick. And here comes the other cat. This is not the cat that's usually here. Bagheera has made a special appearance. Hi. This new neighbor above me is also very loud. He's been making a lot of noise every single night. There's just no getting away from it. Where is Eric? I saw he saw my message. Oh, you just plopped down right on my lap. Are you comfortable? You gonna help keep Steven entertained while we're waiting on Eric? Maybe I should have waited until he confirmed that he was ready. Buddy. Well, this is just the Bagheera show right now. Look how cute you can be. See how cute you are? You see your face? That's you. My big fat boy. Well, if he doesn't come soon, I might have to, like, stop the video and start a new one when he is ready. Kitten, kitten, kitten. Alright. Buddy. Okay, is Eric here now? Okay, cool. Yay. I see that they're... Wait, let me see. Okay. We've got, where are you going? The other cat. Bagheera's here this time instead of Louie. Alright, so where we left off, Cloth was having sex with this, what's it called? A Florian? Florian. I think that was sex. It was a really weird description of that. Okay. So, chapter 96. The fire itself. I woke with something brushing at the edges of my memory. I opened my eyes and saw trees stretched against a twilight sky. There were silken pillows all around me, while a few feet away Felurian lay, her naked body loosely splayed in sleep. She looked smooth and perfect as a sculpture. She sighed in her sleep, and I chided myself for the thought. I knew she was nothing like cold stone. She was warm and supple, the smoothest marble grindstone by comparison. My hand reached out to touch her, but I stopped myself, not wanting to disturb the perfect scene before me. A distant thought began to nag at me, but I brushed it away like an irritating fly. Florian's lips parted, and she sighed. Where are you going? You were keeping me warm. Making a sound like a dove. I remembered the touch of those lips. I ached and forced myself to look away from her soft flower petal mouth. Her closed eyelids were patterned like a butterfly's wings, swept in whorls of deep purple and black with traceries of pale gold that blended to the color of her skin. As her eyes moved gently in sleep, the pattern shifted, as if the butterfly fanned its wings. That sight alone was probably worth the price all men must pay for seeing it. I ate her with my eyes, knowing all the songs and stories I had heard were nothing. She is what men dream of. All the places I have been, all the women I have seen, I have met her equal only once. Something in my mind screamed at me, but I was bemused by the motion of her eyes beneath her lids, the shape her mouth made as if she would kiss me even while she slept. I swatted the thought away again, irritated. I was going to go mad or die. The idea finally fought its way through to my conscious mind, and I felt every hair on my body stand suddenly on end. I had a moment of perfect, clear lucidity that resembled coming up for air and quickly closed my eyes, trying to lower myself into the heart of stone. It didn't come. For the first time in my life, that cool, taciturn state escaped me. But behind my eyes, Florian distracted me. Hey! Don't! Sorry for that loud noise. That was an accident. I was just trying to get Louis' attention because he was scratching the carpet. My brand new carpet. Come up here. Alright, I got both cats here. They're both off camera, but they're here. Okay, behind my eyes, Florian distracted me. The sweet breath, the soft breast, the urgent, half-despairing sighs that slipped through my hungry, petal-tender lips. Excuse me. Stone. I kept my eyes closed and wrapped the calm rationality of Heart of Stone around me like a mantle before I dared even think of her again. What did I know? I brought to mind 100 stories of Florian and plucked out the recurring themes. Florian was beautiful. She charmed mortal men. What are you doing? The third cat, I have too many cats. He is making all kinds of noises right now. And now they're fighting. Okay, cool. That's not distracting at all. What did I know? I brought to mind 100 stories of Florian and plucked out the recurring themes. Florian was beautiful. She charmed mortal men. They followed her into the Fae and died in her embrace. How did they die? It was fairly simple to guess. Extreme physical stress. Things had been rather rigorous. And my cats are being very vocal right now. And the sedentary or frail might not have fared so well as I. Now that I stopped to notice, my entire body felt like a well-wrung rag. My shoulders ached, my knees burned, and my neck bore the sweet bruising of love bites from my right ear, down my chest, and my body flushed and I struggled deeper into the Heart of Stone until my pulse slowed and I could force the thought of her from the front of my mind. I could remember 4 stories where men had come back from the Fae alive, all of them cracked as the potter's cobbles. What manner of madness did they exhibit? Obsessive behavior, accidental death due to separation from reality, and wasting away from extreme melancholy. 3 died within a span of days. The 4th story told of the man lasting nearly half a year. But something didn't make sense. Admittedly, the Florian was lovely, skilled, without a doubt, but to the extent that every man died or went insane, no, it simply wasn't likely. I don't mean to belittle the experience. I don't doubt for a second that it had quite naturally deprived men of their faculties in the past. I, however, knew myself to be quite sane. I briefly entertained the notion that I was insane and didn't know it. Then I considered the possibility that I had always been insane, acknowledged it as more likely than the former, then pushed both thoughts from my mind. Eyes still closed, I lay there, enjoying a quiet languor of a sort I'd never felt before. I savored the moment, then opened my eyes and prepared to make my escape. I looked around the pavilion, its silken draperies and scattered cushions. These were only ornaments for Florian. She lay in the middle of it all rounded hip and slender leg and lithe muscle shifting underneath her skin. She was watching me. If she was beautiful at rest, she was doubly so awake. Asleep, she was a painting of a fire. Awake, she was the fire itself. Chapter title. It may seem strange to you that at this point I felt fear. It may seem strange that only an arm's length from the most attractive woman in the world I was suddenly reminded of my own mortality. She smiled like a knife in velvet and stretched like a cat in the sun. Her body was built to stretch, the arch of her back, the smooth expanse of her belly going taut. The round fullness of her breasts was lifted by the motion of her arms, and suddenly I felt like a stag in rut. My body reacted to her, and I felt as if someone were hammering at the cool impassivity of Heart of Stone with a hot poker. My control slipped for a moment, and a less disciplined piece of my mind started composing a song to her. I couldn't spare the attention to rein that piece of myself back in, so I focused on staying safe in the Heart of Stone, ignoring both her body and that nattering part of my mind forming rhyming couplets somewhere in the back of my head. It wasn't the easiest thing to do. As a matter of fact, it made the ordinary rigors of sympathy seem simple as skipping. If not for the training I'd received at the university, I would have been a broken, pitiful thing, only able to concentrate on my own captivation. Felurian slowly relaxed out of her stretch and looked at me with ancient eyes. Eyes unlike anything I had ever seen. They were a striking color. The summer dusk was in her eyes. A sort of twilight blue. They were fascinating, in fact, with lids of winged butterflies. There wasn't any white to them at all. Her lips the shade of sunset skies. I clenched my jaw, split that shattering piece of myself away, and walled it off in a distant corner of my mind, letting it sing to itself. Felurian tilted her head to one side. Her eyes were as intent and as expressionless as a bird's. "Why are you so quiet, flame lover? Have I quenched you?" Her voice was odd to my ear. It had no rough edges to it at all. It was all quiet smoothness, like a piece of perfectly polished glass. Despite its odd softness, Felurian's voice ran down my spine, making me feel like a cat that's just been stroked down to the tip of its tail. I retreated further into the Heart of Stone, felt it cool and reassuring around me. However, while the majority of my attention was focused on self-control, the small, mad, lyric part of my mind leapt to the fore and said, "Never quenched. Though I am doused in you, I burn. The motion of your turning head is like a song, is like a spark, is like a breath that billows me and fans to flame a fire that cannot help but spread and roar your name." Felurian's face lit up. "A poet! I should have known you for a poet by how your body moved." The gentle hush of her voice caught me unprepared again. It wasn't that her words were breathy or husky or sultry. It was nothing so tawdry or affected as that. But when she spoke, I couldn't help but be aware of the fact that her breath was pressed from her breast, past the soft sweetness of her throat, then shaped by the careful play of lips and teeth and tongue. She came closer, moving on her hands and knees through the pillows. "You looked like a poet, fiery and fair." Her voice was no louder than a breath as she cupped my face with her hands. "Poets are gentler. They say nice things." There was only one person I'd ever heard whose voice was similar to this. Eladin. On rare occasions his voice would fill the air as if the world itself were listening. Felurian's voice was not resonant. It did not fill the forest glade. Hers was the hush before a sudden summer storm. It was soft as a brushing feather. It made my heart step sideways in my chest. Speaking thus, when she called me a poet, it did not raise my hackles or make me grit my teeth. From her it sounded like the sweetest thing a man was ever called. Such was the power of her voice. Felurian brushed her fingertips across my lips. "Poet kisses are best. You kiss me like a candle flame." She brought one of her hands back to touch her mouth, her eyes bright at the memory. I took her hand and pressed it tenderly. My hands have always seemed graceful, but next to hers they looked brutish and crude. I breathed against her palm as I spoke. "Your kisses are like sunlight on my lips." She lowered her eyes, butterfly wings dancing. I felt my mindless need for her slacken and began to understand. This was magic, but nothing like what I knew, not sympathy or sygaldry. Felurian made men mad with desire the same way I gave off body heat. It was natural for her, but she could control it. Her gaze wandered over my tangle of clothes and belongings strewn messily at one corner of the glade. They looked oddly out of place amid the silks and soft colors. I saw her eyes settle on my lute case. She froze. "Is my flame a sweet poet? Does he sing?" Her voice trembled, and I could feel a tenseness in her body as she waited for an answer. She looked back at me. I smiled. Felurian scampered off and brought back my lute case like a child with a new toy. As I took it, I saw her eyes were wide and wet. I looked into her eyes, and in a flash of understanding I realized what her life must be like. 1,000 years old and lonely from time to time. If she wanted companionship, she had to seduce and lure. And for what? An evening of company? An hour? How long could an average man last before his will broke and he became as mindless as a fawning dog? Not long. And who would she meet in the forest? Farmers and hunters? What entertainment could they provide, slaved to her passions? I felt a moment of pity for her. I know what loneliness is like. I took the lute from its case and began to tune it. I struck an experimental chord and carefully tuned it again. My tongue is not releasing from the roof of my mouth. Let me take a sip of water. What to play for the most beautiful woman in the world? It wasn't hard to decide, actually. My father had taught me to judge an audience. I struck up Sister's Flynn. If you've never heard of it, I'm not surprised. It's a bright and lively song about two sisters gossiping while they argue over the price of butter. Most people want to hear stories of legendary adventure and romance, but what do you play for someone out of legend? What do you play for someone out of legend? What do you sing for a woman who has been the object of romance for a mortal age? You play her songs of ordinary people. So I hoped. She clapped delightedly at the end of it. More! More? She smiled hopefully, cocking her head to make it a request. Her eyes were wide and eager and adoring. I played her Larm and his Elliput. I played her Blacksmith's Daughters. I played her a ridiculous song about a priest chasing a cow that I'd written when I was 10 and never even named. Florian laughed and applauded. She covered her mouth in shock and her eyes in embarrassment. The more I played, the more she reminded me of a young country wife attending her first fair, full of pure joy, face shining with innocent delight, eyes wide in amazement at everything she sees. And lovely, of course. I concentrated on my fingering so as not to think about it. After each song, she rewarded me with a kiss that made it difficult to decide what to play next. Not that I minded horribly. I'd come to realize rather quickly that I preferred kisses to coins. I played her Tinker Tanner. Let me tell you, the image of Felurian, her quiet, fluting voice singing the chorus of my favorite drinking song, is something that will never, never leave me, not until I die. All the while I felt the charm she had on me slacken, bit by bit. It gave me room to breathe. I relaxed and let myself slide a little farther out of the heart of stone. Dispassionate calm can be a useful frame of mind, but it does not make for a compelling performance. I played for hours, and by the end of it I felt like myself again, by which I mean I could look at Felurian with no more reaction than you might normally feel looking at the most beautiful woman in the world. I can still remember her, sitting naked among the cushions, twilight-colored butterflies dancing in the air between us. I wouldn't have been alive had I not been aroused, but my mind seemed to be my own again, and I was grateful for that. She made a disappointed noise of protest as I set the lute back into its case. "Are you weary?" she asked with a hint of a smile. "I would not have tired you, sweet poet, had I known." I gave my best apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, but it seems to be getting late." Actually, the sky still showed the same purple hint of twilight it had since I first awoke, but I pushed on. I'll need to be moving quickly if I'm to meet... My mind went numb as quickly as if I'd been struck a blow to the back of my head. I felt the passion, fierce and insatiable. I felt the need to have her, to crush her body to mine, to taste the savage sweetness of her mouth. Only because of my arcane training did I hold on to any concept of my own identity at all. Even so, I only held it with my barest fingertips. Felurian sat cross-legged on the cushions across from me, her face angry and terrible, her eyes cold and hard as distant stars. With a deliberate calm, she brushed a slowly fanning butterfly from her shoulder. There was such a weight of fury in her simple gesture that my stomach clenched and I realized this fact. No one ever left Felurian. Ever. She kept men until their bodies and minds broke beneath the strain of loving her. She kept them until she tired of them, and when she sent them away it was the leaving that drove men mad. I was powerless. I was a novelty. I was a toy, favorite because it was newest. It might be a long while before she tired of me, but the time would come, and when she finally set me free, my mind would tear itself apart with wanting her. All right, chapter 97. Blood and Bitter Rue. As I sat among the stilts with my control slipping away, I felt a wave of cold sweat sweep over my body. I clenched my jaw and felt a small anger flare up. Over the course of my life, my mind has been the only thing I've always been able to rely on, the only thing that has always been entirely mine. I could feel my resolve melting as my natural desires were replaced by some animal thing unable to think beyond its own lust. Hello, kitten. The part of me that was still Quoth raged, but I felt my body respond to her presence. With a horrible fascination, I felt myself crawl through the cushions toward her. One arm found her slender waist, and I bent to kiss her with a terrible hunger. Yeah, that was weird. I howled inside my own mind. I have been beaten and whipped, starved and stabbed, but my mind is my own, no matter what becomes of this body or the world around. I threw myself against the bars of an intangible cage made of moonlight and desire. And somehow I held myself away from her. My breath tore out of my throat as if racing to escape. Felurian reclined on the cushions, her head tilted up toward me. Her lips were pale and perfect, her eyes half-lidded and hungry. I forced myself to look away from her face, but there was nowhere safe to look. Her throat was smooth and delicate, trembling with her rapid pulse. One breast stood round and full, while the other angled slightly to one side, following the downward slope of her body. They rose and fell with her breath, moving gently, making candle-cast shadows on her skin. I glimpsed the perfect whiteness of her teeth behind the pale pink of her parted lips. I closed my eyes, but somehow that only made it worse. The heat of her body was like standing near a fire. The skin of her waist was soft beneath my hand. She moved beneath me, and her breast brushed softly against my chest. I felt her breath against my neck. I shivered and began to sweat. I opened my eyes again and saw her staring at me. Her expression was innocent, almost hurt, as if she couldn't understand being refused. I nursed my small flame of anger. No one did this to me. No one! I held myself away from her. A slight line of a frown touched her forehead, as if she were annoyed, or angry, or concentrating. Felurian reached up to touch my face, her eyes intent as if trying to read something written deep inside me. I tried to pull back, remembering her touch, but my body simply shook. Beads of sweat fell from my skin to patter gently on the silk cushions and the flat plane of her stomach below. She touched my cheek softly. Softly, I bent to kiss her, and something broke in my mind. I felt the snap as 4 years of my life slid away. Suddenly I was back on the streets of Tarbean. 3 boys, bigger than me with greasy hair and piggish eyes, had dragged me from the broken crate where I had been sleeping. 2 of them held me down, pinning my arms. I lay in a stagnant puddle that was bitterly cold. It was early in the morning and the stars were out. One of them had his hand over my mouth. It didn't matter. I had been in the city for months. I knew better than to yell for help. At best, no one would come. At worst, someone would, and then there would be more of them. 2 of them held me down. The third cut my clothes off my body. He cut me. They told me what they were going to do. Their breath was horribly warm against my face. They laughed. There in Tarbean, half naked and helpless, I felt something well up inside me. I bit 2 fingers off the hand over my mouth. I heard a scream and swearing as one of them staggered away. I strained and strained against the one who was still on top of me. I heard my own arm break as his grip loosened. I started to howl. I threw him off. Still screaming, I stood, my clothes hanging in rags around me. I knocked one of them to the ground. My scrabbling hand found a loose cobblestone, and I used it to break one of his legs. I remember the noise it made. I flailed until his arms were broken, then I broke his head. When I looked up, I saw the one who had cut me was gone. The third huddled against the wall. He clutched his bloody hand to his chest. His eyes were white and wild. Then I heard footsteps approaching, and I dropped the stone and ran and ran and ran. Suddenly, years later, I was that feral boy again. I jerked my head back and snarled inside my mind. I felt something deep inside myself. I reached for it. A tense stillness settled inside of me, the sort of silence that comes before a thunderclap. I felt the air begin to crystallize around me. I felt cold. Detachedly, I gathered up the pieces of my mind and fit them all together. I was Quoth the trooper, Edema Rue born. I was Quoth the student, Relar under Elodin. I was Quoth the musician. I was Quoth. I stood above Felurian. I felt as if this was the only time in my life I had been fully awake. Everything looked clear and sharp, as if I was seeing with a new set of eyes. As if I wasn't bothering with my eyes at all, and was looking at the world directly with my mind. The sleeping mind, some piece of me realized faintly. No longer sleeping, I thought and smiled. I looked at Felurian, and in that moment I understood her down to the bottoms of her feet. She was of the Fae. She did not worry over right or wrong. She was a creature of pure desire, much like a child. A child does not concern itself with consequence, neither does a sudden storm. Felurian resembled both, and neither. She was ancient and innocent and powerful and proud. Was this the way Elodin saw the world? Was this the magic he spoke of? Not secrets or tricks, but Taborlin the great magic. Always there, but beyond my seeing until now? It was beautiful. I met Felurian's eyes, and the world grew slow and sluggish. I felt as if I had been thrust under water, as if my breath had been pressed from my body. For that tiny moment I was stunned and numb, as if I had been struck by lightning. The moment passed, and things began to move again. But now, looking into Felurian's twilight eyes, I understood her far beyond the bottoms of her feet. Now I knew her to the marrow of her bones. Her eyes were like 4 lines of music, clearly penned. My mind was filled with the sudden song of her. I drew a breath and sang it out in 4 hard notes. Felurian sat upright. She passed her hand before her eyes and spoke a word as sharp as shattered glass. There was a pain like thunder in my head. Darkness flickered at the edges of my sight. I tasted blood and bitter rue. The world snapped back into focus, and I caught myself before I fell. Felurian frowned, straightened, stood. Her face intent, she took a step. Standing, she was not tall or terrible. Her head was barely level with my chin. Her dark hair hung, a sheaf of shadow, straight as a knife until it brushed against her curving hip. She was slight and pale and perfect. Never have I seen a face so sweet, a mouth so made for kissing. She was no longer frowning, not smiling either. Her hips were soft and slightly parted. She took another step. The simple motion of her moving leg was like a dance, the unexaggerated shifting of her hip entrancing as a fire. The arch of her bare foot said more of sex than anything I'd seen in my young life. Another step. Her smile was fierce and full. She was as lovely as the moon. Her power hung about her like a mantle. It shook the air. It spread behind her like a pair of vast and unseen wings. Close enough to touch, I felt her power thrumming in the air. Desire rose around me like the sea in storm. She raised her hand. She touched my chest. I shook. She met my eyes, and in the twilight written there, I saw again the 4 clear lines of song. I sang them out. They burst from me like birds into the open air. Suddenly my mind was clear again. I drew a breath and held her eyes in mine. I sang again, and this time I was full of rage. I shouted out the 4 hard notes of a song. I sang them tight and white and hard as iron. And at the sound of them I felt her power shake, then shatter, leaving nothing in the empty air but ache and anger. Felurian gave a startled cry and sat so suddenly that it was almost like a fall. She curled her knees toward herself and huddled, watching me with wide and frightened eyes. Looking around, I saw the wind. Not the way you might see smoke or fog. I saw the ever-changing wind itself. It was familiar as the face of a forgotten friend. I laughed and spread my arms, marveling at its shifting shape. I cupped my hands and breathed a sigh into the hollow space within. I spoke a name. I moved my hands and wove my breath gossamer thin. It billowed out, engulfing her, then burst into a silver flame that trapped her tight inside its changing name. I held her there above the ground. She watched me with an air of fear and disbelief, her dark hair dancing like a second flame inside the first. I knew then that I could kill her. It would be as simple as throwing a sheet of paper to the wind. But the thought sickened me, and I was reminded of ripping the wings from a butterfly. Killing her would be destroying something strange and wonderful. A world without Felurian was a poorer world. A world I would like a little less. It would be like breaking Ilian's loot. It would be like burning down a library in addition to ending a life. On the other hand, my safety and sanity were at stake. I believed the world was more interesting with Quoth in it as well. But I couldn't kill her. Not like this. Not wielding my newfound magic like a dissecting knife. I spoke again, and the wind brought her down among the pillows. I made a tearing motion, and the silver flame that once had been my breath became 3 notes of broken song and went to play among the trees. I sat. She reclined. We looked each other over for several long minutes. Her eyes flashed from fear to caution to curiosity. I saw myself reflected in her eyes, naked among the cushions. My power rode like a white star on my brow. Then I began to feel a fading, a forgetting. I realized the name of the wind no longer filled my mouth, and when I looked around I saw nothing but empty air. I tried to remain outwardly calm, but as these things left me I felt like a lute whose strings were being cut. My heart clenched with a loss I hadn't felt since my parents died. I could see a slight shimmer in the air around Felurian, some shred of her power returning. I ignored it as I struggled frantically to keep some part of what I had learned. But it was like trying to hold a handful of sand. If you ever dreamed of flying, then come awake, dismayed to realize you had lost the trick of it, you have some inkling how I felt. Piece by piece it faded until there was nothing left. I felt hollow inside and ached as badly as if I'd discovered my family never loved me. I swallowed against the lump in my throat. Felurian looked at me curiously. I could see myself reflected in her eyes, the star on my forehead no more than a pinprick of light. Then even the perfect vision of my sleeping mind began to fade. I looked desperately at the world around me. I tried to memorize the sight of it, unblinking. Then it was gone. I bowed my head, half in grief and half to hide the tears. Well, that was intense. Wow. Okay. You gonna come join us, Bagheera? You wanna be on my lap? Okay, never mind. Oops, sorry. Okay, sorry. Trying to get a little bit more. I have no back support, so I'm trying to get more comfortable. Okay. Chapter 98, The Lay of Felurian. A long moment passed before I regained enough of my composure to look up. There was a hesitancy in the air, as if we were young lovers who didn't know what was expected of us next, who didn't know what parts we were supposed to play. I picked up my lute and brought it close to my chest. The motion was instinctive, like clutching a wounded hand. I struck a chord out of habit, then made it minor so the lute seemed to be saying, sad. Without thinking or looking up, I began to play one of the songs I had written in the months after my parents died. It was called Sitting by the Water, Remembering. My fingers strummed sorrow into the evening air. It was several minutes before I realized what I was doing, and several more before I stopped. I wasn't done with the song. I don't know if it really has an ending. I felt better, not good by any means, but better, less empty. My music always helped. As long as I had my music, no burden was ever too heavy to bear. I looked up and saw tears on Felurian's face. It made me less ashamed of my own. I also felt myself wanting her. The emotion was dampened by the ache in my chest, but that touch of desire focused my attention on my most immediate concern, survival, escape. Felurian seemed to reach a decision and started through the cushions toward me. Moving in a curious crawl, she stopped several feet away and looked at me. It's a good question. I don't know what happened. Was all very sudden and it escalated very fast. It just happens when you wander through a forest, there's just sometimes there's a Felurian, or I don't know what her, Felurian is her name, I don't know what she's called. But sometimes there's just one of those women, and it just happens, Does my tender poet have a name? Her voice was so gentle it startled me. I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped. I thought of the moon, caught by her own name, and 1,000 fairy stories I had heard as a child. If you believed Ulliden, names were the bones of the world. I hesitated for about half a second before I decided I had given Felurian a damn sight more than my name already. I am Cloth. The sound of it seemed to ground me, to put me inside myself again. Cloth. She spoke it softly, and it reminded me of a bird calling. Would you sing sweet for me again? She reached out slowly, as if afraid of being burned, and laid her hand lightly on my arm. Please? Your songs are like a caress, my Cloth. She pronounced my name like the beginning of a song. It was lovely. However, I wasn't entirely comfortable with the way she referred to me as her Cloth. I smiled and nodded, mostly because I didn't have a better idea. I struck a couple of tuning chords, then paused, thinking. Then I started to play In the Forest Fae, a song about, of all things, Felurian herself. Oh, she's a Fae, that's right. It wasn't particularly good. It used about 3 chords and 24 words, but it had the effect I was looking for. Felurian brightened at the mention of her name. There was no false modesty in her. She knew she was most beautiful, most skilled. She knew men told stories, and she knew her reputation. No man could resist her. No man could endure her. By the end of the song, pride had her sitting straighter. I finished the song. Would you like to hear another? I asked. She nodded and grinned eagerly. She sat among the cushions, back straight, as regal as a queen. I moved into a second song, similar to the first. It was called Lady Fae, or something of the sort. I didn't know who had written it, but they had an appalling habit of sticking extra syllables into their lines. It wasn't bad enough to get anything thrown at me in a tavern, but it was close. I watched Felurian closely as I played. She was flattered, but I could read a slight dissatisfaction growing, as if she was irritated, but she couldn't decide why. Perfect. Last I played a song written for Queen Serul. I guarantee you haven't heard it, but I'm sure you know the type. It was written by some toadying minstrel looking for patronage, and my father had taught it to me as an example of certain things to avoid when writing a song. It was a numbing example of mediocrity. You could tell the writer was either truly inept, had never met Serul, or simply didn't find her attractive at all. While singing it, I simply exchanged the name Felurian for Serul. I also replaced some of the better phrases with less poetic ones. By the time I was through with it, the song was truly wretched, and Felurian wore an expression of naked dismay upon her face. I sat for a long moment, as if deeply considering something. When I finally did speak, my voice was hushed and hesitant. "Lady, might I write a song for you?" I gave her a sheepish smile. Her smile was like the moon through the clouds. She clapped her hands and threw herself onto me with a kittenish delight, peppering me with kisses. Only fear that my lute might be broken kept me from properly enjoying the experience. Felurian pulled away and sat very still. I tried a couple of chord combinations, then stilled my hands and looked up at her. I will call it The Lay of Felurian. A chapter name. She blushed a bit and looked at me through lowered eyes, her expression bashful and brazen. All immodest boasting aside, I write a fine song when I set my hand to it, and my skills had recently been sharpened in the mayor's employ. I am not the best, but I am one of the best. Given enough time, a worthy subject, and the proper motivation, I dare say I could write a song nearly as well as Ilion. Nearly. Closing my eyes, I coaxed sweet strains from my lute. My fingers flew, and I captured the music of wind in the branches, of rustling leaves. Then I looked to the back of my mind, where the mad, chattering part of me had been composing a song to Felurian all this while. I brushed the strings more lightly and began to sing. Flashing moon silver, midnight blue her eyes. The lids were subtle-colored butterflies. Her hair swayed, a dark scythe swinging. Through the trees, the wind singing. Felurian, O lady fair, blessed be your forest glade. Your breath is light upon the air, your hair is shadow-dappled shade. Felurian grew still as I sang. Toward the end of the chorus, I could hardly tell if she was breathing. A few of the butterflies that had been frightened away by our earlier conflict came dancing back to us. One of them landed on Felurian's hand, brushing its wings once, twice, as if curious why its mistress was so sudden still. I turned my eyes to my lute again and chose notes like raindrops licking the leaves of trees. She danced in dancing shadows candle cast. She held my eyes, my face, my form, full fast. Her smile a snare 10 times as strong, as legendary fairy song. O lady fair, Felurian, your kiss is honeysuckle sweet. I pity any other man, unknown to you and incomplete. I watched her from the corner of my eye. She sat as if listening with her entire body. Her eyes were wide. She'd raised one hand to her mouth, upsetting the butterfly resting there, while the other pressed against her chest as she drew a slow breath. This is what I had wanted, but I regretted it nonetheless. I bent over my lute and danced my fingers across the strings. I wove chords like water over river stones, like a soft breath against the ear. Then I steeled myself and sang. Her eyes were of the bluest black, like night sky with the clouds blown black. Oh my God. With the clouds blown back. Her skills in love. I stuttered my fingers on the strings, pausing for just a moment as if unsure of something. I saw Felurian wake halfway from her reverie and continued. Her skills in love they do suffice. In close embrace men find her nice. Felurian, O mistress bright, your touch more sought than silver. What? Even though I was expecting the interruption, the ice in her voice startled me into a jangle of notes and sent several butterflies into flight. I took a breath, assumed my most innocent expression, and looked up. Her expression was a storm of rage and disbelief. Nice? I felt the blood drain from my face at her tone. Her voice was still round and gentle as a distant flute, but that meant nothing. Distant thunder doesn't drub the ears. You feel it prowling through your chest. The quiet of her voice moved through me in that distant thunder way. Nice? It was nice, I said to mollify her, my air of innocence only half affected. She opened her mouth as if she would speak, then closed her mouth. Her eyes flashed pure fury. I'm sorry, I said. I should have known better than to try. I pitched my voice somewhere between broken spirit and beaten child. I lowered my hands from the lute strings. Some of the fire left her, but when she found her voice it was tight and dangerous. My skills suffice? She hardly seemed able to force out the last word. Her mouth formed a thin, outraged line. I exploded, my voice a roll of thunder. How the hell am I supposed to know? It's not like I've ever done this sort of thing before. She reeled back at the vehemence of my words, some of the anger draining out of her. What is it you mean? She trailed off, confused. This! I gestured awkwardly at myself, at her, at the cushions and the pavilion around us, as if that explained everything. The last of the anger left her as I saw realization begin to dawn. You... No. I looked down, my face growing hot. I have never been with a woman. Then I straightened and looked her in the eye, as if challenging her to make an issue out of it. Felurian was still for a moment, then her mouth turned up into a wry smile. You tell me a fairy story, my cloth. I felt my face go grim. I don't mind being called a liar. I am a marvelous liar. but I hate being called a liar when I'm telling you the perfect truth." Regardless of its motivation, my expression seemed to convince her. "But you were like a gentle summer storm." She made a fluttering gesture with a hand. "You were a dancer fresh upon the field." Her eyes glittered wickedly. I tucked that comment away for later ego-polishing purposes. My reply was slightly wounded. "Please, I'm not a complete rube. I've read several books." Felurian giggled like a brook. "You learned from books." She looked at me as if she couldn't decide whether or not to take me seriously. She laughed, stopped, then laughed again. I didn't know if I should be offended. "You were rather good, too," I said hurriedly, knowing I sounded like the last dinner guest to compliment her on a salad. "As a matter of fact, I've read—" "Books? Books! You compare me with books!" Her anger crashed over me. Then, without even pausing for breath, Felurian laughed again, high and delighted. Her laugh was wild as a fox's cry, clear and sharp as morning bird song. It was no human sound. I put on my innocent face. "Isn't it always like this?" I kept my expression calm while inwardly I braced myself for another outburst. She simply sat. "I am Felurian." It wasn't a simple stating of a name. It was a declaration. It was a proud flag flying. I held her eyes for a moment, then sighed and dropped my gaze to my lute. "I'm sorry about the song. I didn't mean to offend you." "It was more lovely than the setting sun," she protested, sounding close to tears. "But nice?" The word seemed bitter to her. I set my lute back into its case. "I'm sorry, I can't fix it without some basis for comparison." I sighed. "Pity, it was a good song. They would have sung it for 1,000 years. My voice was thick with regret. Felurian's expression brightened as if with an idea. Then her eyes narrowed into slits. She looked at me as if she were trying to read something written on the inside of my skull. She knew. She knew I was holding the unfinished song as ransom. The unspoken messages were clear. Unless I leave, I can never finish the song. Unless I leave, no one will ever hear these beautiful words I have made for you. Unless I leave and taste the fruits mortal women have to offer, I'll never know how skilled you truly are. There, amid the cushions, under the eternal twilight sky, Felurian and I stared at each other. She held a butterfly, and my hand rested on the smooth wood of my lute. Two armored knights eyeing each other across a bloody field could not have matched the intensity of our stare. Felurian spoke slowly, gauging my response. "If you go, will you finish it?" I tried to look surprised, but I wasn't fooling her. I nodded. "Will you come back to me and sing it?" My surprise became genuine. I hadn't considered her asking for that. I knew there would be no leaving the second time. I hesitated, but only for a barest moment. Half a loaf is better than none. I nodded. "Promise?" I nodded again. "Promise with kisses?" She closed her eyes and tilted her head back like a flower basking in the sun. Life is too short to refuse offers like that. I moved toward her, drew her naked body toward my own, and kissed her as well as my limited practice would allow. It seemed to be good enough. As I pulled away, she looked up at me and sighed. "Your kisses are like snowflakes on my lips." She lay back on the cushions, head resting on her arm. Her free hand brushed my cheek. To say she was lovely is such an understatement I cannot begin to repair it. I realized that over the last several minutes she hadn't been trying to make me desire her, at least not in any supernatural sense. She brushed her lips lightly over the palm of my hand and released it. Then she lay still, watching me intently. I was flattered. To this day I know of only one answer to a question so politely phrased. I bent to kiss her, and laughing, she took me in her arms. Okay. I can probably do one more. Yeah. This one's fairly short, this next one. Alright, chapter 99. Magic of a different kind. By this point in my life, I'd earned myself a modest reputation. No, that's not entirely true. It's better to say that I had built myself a reputation. I'd crafted it deliberately. I'd cultivated it. 3/4 of the stories folk told about me at the university were ridiculous rumors I'd started myself. I spoke 8 languages. I could see in the dark. When I was 3 days old, my mother hung me in a basket from a rowan tree by the light of the full moon. That night, a fairy laid a powerful charm on me to always keep me safe. It turned my eyes from blue to leafy green. I knew how stories worked, you see. Nobody believed that I'd traded a cupped handful of my own fresh blood to a demon in exchange for an alar like a blade of Ramson steel, but still, I was the highest-ranked duelist in Dahl's class. On a good day, I could beat any two of them together. That is a good point. The thread of truth wove through the story, gave it strength. So even though you might not believe it, you might tell it to a wide-eyed first-term student with a drink in him, just to watch his face, just for fun. And if you'd had a drink or three yourself, you might begin to wonder. And so the stories spread, and so, around the university at least, my tiny reputation grew. There were a few true stories as well, pieces of my reputation I'd honestly earned. I had rescued Fella from a blazing inferno. I had been whipped in front of a crowd and refused to bleed. I'd called the wind and broken Ambrose's arm. Still, I knew my reputation was a coat spun out of cobweb. It was storybook nonsense. There were no demons out there bargaining for blood. There were no helpful fairies granting magic charms. And though I might pretend, I knew I was no Taborlin the Great. These were my thoughts when I excuse me. These were my thoughts when I woke, tangled in Felurian's arms. I lay quietly among the cushions for a time, her head resting lightly on my chest, her leg thrown loosely over mine. Looking up through the trees at the twilight sky, I realized I could not recognize the stars. They were brighter than those in the mortal sky, their patterns unfamiliar. It was only then that I realized my life had taken a step in a new direction. Up until now, I had been playing at being a young Taborlin. I had spun lies around myself, pretending to be a storybook hero. But now there was no sense in pretending. What I'd done was truly worth a story, every bit as odd and wonderful as any tale of Taborlin himself. I'd followed Felurian into the Fae, then bested her with magics I couldn't explain, let alone control. I felt different now, more solid somehow. Not older, exactly, not wiser, but I knew things that I'd never known before. I knew the Fae were real. I knew their magic was real. Felurian could break a man's mind with a kiss. Her voice could tug me like a puppet by its strings. There were things I could learn here. Strange things, powerful things, secret things I might never ever have a chance to learn again. I gently freed myself from Felurian's sleeping embrace and walked down to the nearby pool. I splashed water on my face and scooped up several handfuls to drink. I looked through the plants that grew at the water's edge. I picked some leaves and chewed them as I considered how I might approach the subject with Felurian. The mint sweetened my breath. When I returned to the pavilion, Felurian was standing there, brushing pale fingers through her long dark hair. I handed her a violet, its color dark as her eyes. She smiled at me and ate it. I decided to approach the subject gently, lest I offended her. I was wondering, I said carefully, if you would be willing to teach me. Get your claws out of there. She reached out to touch the side of my face gently. Foolish sweet, she said fondly. Have I not already begun? I felt excitement rise in my chest, amazed that it could be so simple. Am I ready for my next lesson? I asked. Her smile grew wider, and she looked me up and down, her eyes going half-lidded and mysterious. Are you? I nodded. It is good you are eager, Felurian said, her fluting voice tinged with amusement. You have some cleverness and natural skill, but there is much to learn. She looked into my eyes, her delicate face gravely serious. When you leave to walk among the mortal, I will not have you shame me. Felurian took my hand and drew me into the pavilion. She pointed. Sit. I sat on a cushion, placing my head level with the smooth expanse of her stomach. Her navel was terribly distracting. She looked down at me, her expression proud and regal as a queen. A Moan, she said, spreading the fingers of one hand and making a deliberate gesture. This we call the hushed heart, an easy lesson to begin, and one I expect you will enjoy. Felurian smiled at me then, her eyes old and knowing. Even before she pushed me back against the cushions and began to bite the side of my neck, I realized that she did not intend to teach me magic. Or if she did, it was magic of a different kind. While it was not the subject I'd hoped to study under her, it's fair to say that I was not entirely disappointed. Learning lovers' arts from Felurian far outstripped any curriculum offered at the university. I am not referring to the vigorous, sweaty wrestling most men, and alas, most women, think of as love. While sweat and vigor are pleasant parts of it, Felurian brought to my attention the subtler pieces. If I were to go into the world, she said, I would not embarrass her by being an incompetent lover, and so she took care to show me a great many things. A few of them in her words: the pinioned wrist, the sigh toward the ear, devouring the neck, drawing the lips, the kissing of the throat, the navel, and, as Florian phrased it, the woman's flower. The breathing kiss, the feather kiss, the climbing kiss. So many different types of kissing. Too many to remember, almost. There was drawing water from the well, the fluttering hand, bird song at morning, circling the moon, playing ivy, the harrowed hair. Just the names would fill a book. Is this like a Karma Sutra thing? Their version of it? But this, I suppose, is not the place for such things. Alas, then, for the world. I don't mean to give the impression that all our hours were spent in dalliance. I was young and Florian was immortal, but there is only so much two bodies can endure. The rest of the time we amused ourselves in other ways. We swam and ate. I played songs for Florian, and she danced for me. I asked Florian a few careful questions about magic, not wanting to offend her by prying at her secrets. Unfortunately, her answers were not particularly enlightening. Her magic came as naturally as breathing. I might as well have asked a farmer how seeds sprouted. When her answers weren't hopelessly nonchalant, they were puzzlingly cryptic. Still, I continued to ask, and she answered as best she could, and occasionally I felt a small spark of understanding. But most of our time was spent telling stories. We had so little in common that stories were all that we could share. You might think Florian and I would be unevenly matched in this regard. She was older than the sky, while I was not yet 17. But Florian was not the narrative treasure trove you would think. Powerful and clever? Certainly. Energetic and lovely? Absolutely. But storytelling was not among her many gifts. I, on the other hand, was of the Idemaru, and we know all the stories in the world. So I told her, the ghost and the goose girl. I told her Tam and the tinker's spade. I told her stories of woodcutters and widows' daughters and the cleverness of orphan boys. In exchange, Florian told me manling stories. The hand at the heart of the pearl. The boy who ran between. The Fae have their own cast of legendary characters. Maven the man-shaped, Alavin Allface. Surprisingly, Florian had never heard of Taborlin the Great or Orin Velsitter, but she did know who Ilian was. It made me proud that one of the Idemaru had gained a place in the stories the Fae tell each other. I wasn't blind to the fact that Florian herself might have the information I was looking for about the Emir and the Chandrian. How much more enjoyable would it be to learn the truth from her, rather than rooting endlessly through ancient books and dusty rooms? Unfortunately, Florian wasn't the mine of information I'd hoped. She knew stories of the Emir, but they were thousands of years old. We should check Urban Dictionary for those names. When I asked her about the more recent Emir, asking about church knights and the Siridae with their bloody tattoos, she merely laughed. There were never any human Emir, she said, dismissing the idea out of hand. Those you speak of sound like children dressing in their parents' clothes. While I might expect that reaction from others, getting it from Florian was particularly disheartening. Still, it was nice to know that I had been right about the Emir existing long before they came knights of the Tillan Church. Then, since the Emir were a lost cause, I tried to steer her in the direction of the Chandrian. No, she said, looking me squarely in the eye, her back straight. I will not speak of the seven. Her soft voice held no lilting whimsy, no playfulness, no room for discussion or negotiation. For the first time since our initial conflict, I felt a trickle of icy fear sweep over me. She was so slight and lovely, it was so easy to forget what she truly was. Still, I couldn't let the subject go so easily. This was, quite literally, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If Florian could be persuaded to tell me even a piece of what she knew, I could learn things no one else in the world might know. I gave her my most charming smile and drew a breath to speak, but before I could get the first word out, Florian leaned forward and kissed me full upon the mouth. Her lips were plush and warm. Her tongue brushed mine, and she bit the swell of my lower lip playfully. When she pulled her mouth from mine, it left me breathless with a racing heart. She looked at me, her dark eyes full of tender sweetness. She laid her hand along my face, brushing my cheek as gently as a flower. My sweet love, she said, if you ask of the seven again in this place, I will drive you from it. No matter if you're asking, be firm or gentle, honest or slantways. If you ask, I will whip you forth from here with a lash of brambles and snakes. I will drive you before me, bloody and weeping, and will not stop until you are dead or fled from Fae. She didn't look away from me as she spoke, and though I hadn't looked away or seen them change, her eyes were no longer soft with adoration. They were dark as storm clouds, hard as ice. I do not jest, she said. I swear this by my flower and the ever-moving moon. I swear it by salt and stone and sky. Did she just swear it by her vagina? I swear this singing and laughing. By the sound of my own name. She kissed me again, pressing her lips to mine tenderly. I will do this thing. And that was the end of it. I might be a fool, but I am not that much of a fool. Felurian was more than willing to talk about the Fae realm itself, and many of her stories detailed the fractious politics of the Faean courts, the Tain Mail, the Dandan, the Gorse Court. These stories were difficult for me to follow, as I didn't know anything about the factions involved, let alone the web of alliances, false friendships, open secrets, and old grudges that bound Fae society together. This was complicated by the fact that Felurian took it for granted that I understood certain things. If I were telling you a story, for example, I wouldn't bother mentioning that most moneylenders are sealdish, or that there is no royalty other than the Modigan royal line. Who doesn't know such things? Felurian left similar details out of her stories. Who wouldn't know, for example, that the Gorse court had meddled in the Barantaltha between the Mill and the House of Fine? And why was this important? Well, of course, that would lead to members of the Gorse being scorned by those on the Dayward side of things. And what was the Barantaltha? A sort of dance. And why was this dance important? After a handful of questions such as this, Felurian's eyes would narrow. I quickly learned it was better to follow along, quiet and confused, rather than try to wrinkle out every detail and risk her irritation. Still, I learned things from these stories, 1,000 small, scattered facts about the Fae, the names of the courts, old battles, and notable persons. I learned you must never look at one of the Tiana with both eyes at once, and that the gift of a single sinus fruit is considered a terrible insult if given to one of the Belladari. God, these are a lot of hard words. You might think these 1,000 facts gave me some insight into the Fae, that I somehow fit them together like puzzle pieces and discovered the true shape of things. 1,000 facts is quite a lot, after all. But no, 1,000 seems like a lot, but there are more stars than that in the sky, and they make neither a map nor a mural. All I knew for certain after hearing Felurian's stories is that I had no desire to ever entangle myself in even the kindest corner of the Faean court. With my luck, I'd whistle while walking under a willow and thereby insult God's barber or something of the sort. Here is the one thing I learned from these stories. The Fae are not like us. This is endlessly easy to forget, because many of them look as we do. They speak our language, they have 2 eyes, they have hands, and their mouths make familiar shapes when they smile. But these things are only seemings. We are not the same. I have heard people say that men in the Fae are as different as dogs and wolves. While this is an easy analogy, it is far from true. Wolves and dogs are only separated by a minor shade of blood. Both howl at night. If beaten, both will bite. No, our people and theirs are as different as water and alcohol. In equal glasses they look the same, both liquid, both clear, both wet after a fashion. But one will burn and the other will not. This has nothing to do with temperament or timing. These 2 things have behaved differently because they are profoundly, fundamentally not the same. The same is true with humans and the Fae. We forget it at our peril. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. So, next time we'll be starting chapter 100. That feels like an accomplishment. Yeah, so that was a lot of material about that Fae. And, yeah, so we'll aim for Sunday. Hopefully you're not working early Monday morning, because I can't really start very early on Sunday. I'm always not really available till at least 8:30 on Sundays. So if it doesn't work out that day, then maybe we skip a day, or if you somehow find out before then that you can't do it, then maybe we'll do a different day before that. I have to look at what your schedule was again. But worst case scenario, the next one will have to be like next week. We'll figure it out. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next one, whenever that is.